Good afternoon. My name is Lynn Goodstedt. I'm Managing Director of LG Communications Consulting and delighted to be co-moderating this august panel this afternoon with my friend and colleague, Carrie Edelstein. So what is the culture in crisis that we're going to discuss today? I don't have to tell you that there are social and political conflicts and debates in American society right now that are dominating pretty much every media platform. And what we want to look at is how these discussions impact the writers, reporters, editors, producers who are creating content in order that it be entertaining and informative and effective and educational. So they do it in many ways. Primetime TV and film use the real world to create believable environments and context for their fictional worlds or to target audiences in a compelling, engaging fashion. Documentary and nonfiction creators on every platform conceivable are actively using content to shape public opinion, behavior, and eventually policy in many cases. And the news media is trying to obtain and deliver the verifiable truth amongst all of the opinions and alternative facts roaming around so that consumers can better understand and negotiate the world that we all live in. We have, I think, an amazing panel of media pros with us today who will discuss and share their experiences in this area, including what their organizations are attempting to accomplish, how they decide to do what they do, and how they, if they do, how they measure their success at it. I want to start introductions. We'll just have everybody start down at the my far right and introduce themselves and a little brief blurb about who they are and what they do, and then we'll get started. Ted, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Ted Shane from Vulcan Productions, which is a production company based in Seattle, Washington, launched and owned by the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen. And I manage and run all of our engagement strategies, working with our distribution partners, NGO partners, policymakers, you name it, to make sure that the content that we're creating is getting out to the world as far and wide as possible, but also we're arming those audiences with actions that they can take and things that they can do, hopefully, to move the needle on the issues that Karen was about.
My name is Ashley Haas, and I work at Participant Media, which is a co-financing and co-production entity started by Jeff Skoll. We focus on content that has some issue at its core, and then what we do is we use the content to raise awareness for the issue, and then the issue to sort of raise awareness for that content or pedigree of that content. I work in between the film and the impact world. I have a background in film, campaigning, and also politics, so I sort of know how to speak both languages and help both sides figure out the best way to utilize that movie and the talent around that movie in order to have some sort of impact around that issue, depending on the current landscape.
I'm Dylan Byers. I do feel like I'm testifying. I feel like Comey. I'm Dylan Byers. I cover media and politics and the intersection of those two for CNN. Formerly was with Politico, doing the same thing, and before that with Adweek. And that's the gist of it, which everything from the relationship between this White House and the press to the influence of news organizations ranging from Fox News to the New York Times to all sorts of new digital players, as well as my own network.
I'm Nicole Carrico, and I work for Good Worldwide, which rounds up 3 media brands, Good Media, Upworthy, and Good Core, which is a social impact consulting services company. I lead the content collaborations organization, so I take our storytelling, distribution, data tracking, and impact knowledge practices and sort of all the tools in our kit, and I bring them to bear on behalf of programs with our strategic and brand partners, usually around and intended impact. We are transparently progressive in our goals and aims, and I run a group called Social Responsibility that also evaluates all of our potential partners, advertising or strategic, to determine if they are indeed a company that we can be working with in good faith, and has built an internal model for forming that determination and allowing it to guide the programs that we run.
And I am Carter Covington. I'm a television writer, producer, showrunner. Most recently, I had a show on MTV called Faking It, which wrapped up a 3-season run last year. And it was a groundbreaking show in the LGBTQ community, nominated for 3 GLAAD Awards. We had the first intersex character in groundbreaking storylines about transgender issues and other LGBT issues, so happy to be here.
I'm Jeff Melvoin. I'm currently executive producer on Designated Survivor. Before I started working in this business, I was a journalist. I spent the last 5 years as a correspondent for Time Magazine. Before I decided if I was going to write fiction for a living, I should get better paid for it. But I started with a socially relevant show, Remington Steele, and I've worked on a dozen series, including Northern Exposure and Picket Fences, and mostly see my job as trying to keep these shows on the air while doing work that we can all be proud of.
I will introduce myself up here. Hi everyone, I'm Carrie Edelstein. I am the co-moderator of this panel with Lynn, and I own a company called Research Narrative, which is a market research and consulting firm focused on data analytics and measurement and consumer insights that specializes in media and entertainment. And we had the good fortune over the last couple of years to work with TED and with Discovery Channel on a film called Racing Extinction, and Lynn worked with us on that as well. And it was a really great chance to work on understanding the impact of something that is intended to have not just ticket sales in theaters and views across the world, but also social impact on the topic of species extinction. And that got us really interested in the whole idea of content with purpose. And we've developed, Lynn and I together, a service called MRISE that is focused on media impact and measurement. And I will be co-moderating this and asking some questions of these guys today. Thank you for coming. So I want to kind of start off with the million-dollar question, which is, what are the different, quote, cultural crisis topics that each of you are addressing at your organizations, and how did you pick those in the scheme of all there is to potentially choose from and talk about? How did you, either in your own careers, for those of you who are producers and writers, and in your companies, for those of you who work for a larger organization, how did you select the topics that you focus on? We'll go down the way again, but feel free to go out of order. We don't have to stick to that regimen.
I guess I'll go first. So for Vulcan, and Vulcan production is relatively unique in that our owner, Paul Allen, is not only someone who's been working in film and media storytelling for some time, but is also a significant philanthropist with interest in a lot of areas of the natural world. And so to your question, how do we decide? A lot of it's based on the fact that Paul's been interested in working in these issues for quite a long time. And so from a storytelling perspective, looking at climate change, oceans, wildlife preservation, all of which, by the way, were sort of explored in that film Racing Extinction that you mentioned. For us, all unique stories about those different elements, those different places. But then a lot of the stories, a lot of the challenges that we're facing in the natural world today, the hot spots aren't here in Los Angeles or here in the United States. Even a lot of times they're on the other side of the world. So part of what we endeavor to do is to bring not only stories from all around the world to people, to viewers here in the States and in the West, but then also helping with folks understand what they might be able to do themselves to save or help save an orangutan in Indonesia and that sort of thing, which is not easy, right? Because other than taking out your checkbook and funding an organization that's working on the ground there, it can get hard. So for us, we look for where are the problems that you think are most pressing. There's no right or wrong answer there. It's relatively subjective. And then thinking about, okay, how can we as an organization that does philanthropy, that does storytelling, that does this sort of work, how can we have the biggest impact? And then from that, see, hopefully, strategy grows, right? And that's sort of how we try to go about deciding and then acting on our issues.
And Ashley, I know you also were talking about being story first when we first met.
And I think it's very similar at Participant, right? The work that we do is driven by Jeff Skoll, our founder, who has some key issues that he cares a lot about, and which he is focused on not only at Participant Media, but also as part of the larger group of sort of institutions that he works with, the Jeff Skoll Foundation and things like that. So we have, some sort of key issues that we're always looking out for, because we know those are, climate change is a great example. These are things that if we don't address immediately, the world is going to be a very different place. With that said, though, really, we're open to any great story, right? And a great story that can shed light and change opinions and change minds about an issue, because that's actually our motto, is media that matters. So Jeff really believes that when people see a piece of content, it can shift their perspective. And in that shift, then you get to a place where people may take some sort of action, whatever that would be, depending on the landscape. So we have a framework, of issues that we look for that are, we're driven to by Jeff, but at the same token, if there's a great story that really is compelling for a particular issue, we would always consider that. We are not, we don't close doors. That's not what we believe in.
Yeah, Ted and Ashley look at the business from a different side of the desk than Carter and I do. They are buyers, essentially, and we are sellers perpetually. When you're pitching a show, you can answer this from a macro sense. When you're pitching a show, you try to pick something that's going to appeal to you. I don't believe in trying to chase the market. You try to figure out what's of interest to you and find which market you want to pitch it in, what platform you want to go to. But more often, or equally often, we're offered things that are on the air, or about to be on the air, and then you try to decide whether that matches your sensibility. And it's tough, because being a good storyteller is the first obligation, and no matter how sincere you are about any particular issue, if you're not telling a good story, nobody's going to come to it. On Designated Survivor, there are a number of topics that are of interest to us, that are of interest to Kiefer Sutherland, who plays the president, and it's just a question of how can you insinuate these things into a good narrative that's going to maintain interest for the audience and not make them feel like they're taking medicine. It used to be, if you wanted to send a message, they'd say, call Western Union. Now that means nothing to my kids, because they don't know what Western Union is, but they get the idea about email. And so, but always you have to be very cautious about hitting people over the head. You've always got to use the Trojan horse approach and get your project into the gates, and then let your troops out. So.
Carter, thoughts related to it?
I would agree with that, and being that I am an openly gay writer, it's in this town, it's rare that I get jobs that don't have some sort of LGBT character or content, because that's my personal experience. So I find the Trojan horse is very apt, because once you have an audience and they're invested in your characters, then you have the freedom to explore things that they may not have signed up for in starting your show. And that's, I think, the exciting thing about television. It can expose people to things and characters and emotions and scenarios that they weren't expecting.
It was interesting, because when you took on Faking It, the showrunner role, at that point, there had been a lot of shows that already had major LGBT themes and signature characters, whether it was Modern Family or going back, Will and Grace, Ellen, et cetera. So talk a little bit about how you found a new spin on that was relevant, especially to a teenage audience, and also coming from the perspective, I don't know if you guys know this, but Carter was raised in North Carolina, right? So, coming from the perspective of a gay kid from the South, right? Yeah, and how you brought some new ideas to that topic, to that conversation.
Yes, and North Carolina wasn't the compassionate, open place it is today. MTV contacted me because they had in development a project called Faking It, which none of you look like the audience for our show. So the premise was two girls, best friends in high school, pretend to be lesbians in order to be cool. And they were not happy with the way it was being developed. They were looking for someone to come in, but they liked the premise and the title. And I pitched to them that I would have, take that scenario, put it in a very liberal high school where being lesbians made them popular because it was the most accepting, open high school you've ever seen on television, and have one of the girls have feelings for her best friend. And so that was the premise of the show, and the show had a very, it was set in Austin, Texas, so it had this red state, blue state divide built into the show. And because of that, we got to do a lot of things because the premise of the show had such a strong purpose, and it was pretty exciting. I started my career 10 years earlier writing a pilot about growing up gay in North Carolina as an 11-year-old, and we shot that pilot for ABC, then ABC Family, but it made Disney nervous because it had a gay protagonist who was 11 years old, and so it's interesting to see how much the world shifted in our show, Faking It. 3 of the 5 series regulars were members of the LGBTQ community, and it was definitely gay. It's a very gay show.
So it's interesting. So Jeff had mentioned that we've got 2 people here who are more on the seller side of content, and then the 2 people on the buyer side. But then we have 2 people in the middle who are kind of neither of those things. So Nicole, you're sort of interesting because you work with brands in particular, and I guess that sort of represents the funding side of some of this stuff. So talk a little bit about what you do in the work with selecting brands and how you pick what kind of brands fit with Upworthy and what the processes that you go through.
Upworthy sort of stumbled into the notion of branded content. When it began, it was a digital storytelling machine just like any other, and brands showed up at the door with bags of money and said, we want to actually fund a lot of content about climate change. We want to fund a lot of content about gender equality. And Upworthy had an audience that was deeply engaged, and we had this brand promise that said we will only bring you stories that we really believe if 1 million people saw them, the world would be a better place, and we're committed to positive framing, we're committed to empathy building, we're committed to not shaming, celebrating who's doing it right, encouraging everyone to get better rather than finger pointing at who's doing it wrong. And so we had this really 2013 magical year of just being able to pick and choose from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Graham Wood Foundation and Unilever, who sunk a tremendous amount of money into a climate change and environmental commitment that was, when we vetted them independently and internally, truly consistent with the way all of those companies operated. And so we could feel really good about running those campaigns, telling stories we would be telling anyway, and running a brand disclaimer beneath them. And those were partnerships that were really rewarding. Unfortunately, there's not an unlimited number of those briefcases of money waiting to fund the kind of stories we wanted to tell. And pretty quickly, we had to start to figure out how we were going to open up our revenue lines and tell more stories and possibly work with brands that were less obvious. And so that became the challenge, but also the opportunity that I have been leading at Upworthy that's really exciting, which is when a company like Whirlpool comes to us and says, we want to run a campaign with you, what's Upworthy about washers and dryers? What are they actually committed to, and what are we committed to, and what is the intersection that makes sense for us here? And so we've sort of worked on this process that leans into our social responsibility team that looks deep within the company and discovers what they do well. Are they great with labor? Are they great with diversity and hiring? Are they great with community impact? Are they great with environmental impact? What do they genuinely stand for? And one of the things that we found in Whirlpool actually really consistently was they had a tremendous commitment to families. They had a great paternity leave plan, a great maternity leave plan. They had really good inclusive benefits, and they had worked hard to try and make families welcome and a part of what Whirlpool does. They were running a campaign that was trying to translate the notion of chores into showing love. You don't do somebody's laundry because you're doing them a favor, you do it because you love them and you want to help them out. And so we were able to find this intersection that said we want to tell stories about diverse families, actually a sandwich generation, which we're seeing a lot more of, which is people who have both their parents and their children living at home and are caretaking in both directions. And we want to tell the story about how these families work and operate and what that looks like in a way that makes us more understanding of the people around us and paints a more accurate picture of the kind of lives that are going on behind the doors behind you. And we believe that Whirlpool has an absolutely legitimate way to be standing behind that. And so we produced a series of videos with them and for them that performed really well and seemed to, the data says we even sold some washers and dryers, shockingly. But what we did was we told stories of families that we wanted to tell, and we got more diverse voices out into the world, and it managed to serve both masters. So it's definitely like, threading the eye of a needle. But if you can and land it. We see those are the campaigns that work best for us, for them, and for the audience. And that's what we're aiming for. That's what we're hoping to do.
That's great, and we're going to come back to the work best and how you measure that, because we're measurement geeks. So Dylan, you certainly have a different angle from the rest of this group, and more of a career imperative to cover a lot of different topics, certainly as a political reporter, but also these days as a media reporter, as the two have intersected. Talk a little bit about how you prioritize and the things you choose, and the big topics that you're really thinking carefully about as you cover the news from a political and media perspective.
Sure. It's a funny question because sometimes it can seem like CNN is only covering one thing at a time, whether that is the Trump White House or missing Malaysian airline. Sometimes not always to our benefit. But the truth is that what's happened in CNN, and I certainly don't want to speak for the company because that's way above my pay grade and I'm just a reporter. But one thing that's happened in terms of trying to wrestle with the incredible changes that are going on in the industry, and I don't just mean the news media industry, but just at large in terms of content delivery and consumption, is how you tell a story and how you tell the news, and in two different ways. One is the how you tell the news in terms of how people are actually consuming it, and there's been an extraordinary investment from CNN to make that diversification and to sort of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And so what that means is that whereas newspapers have been better about adapting to the digital space, experimenting with VR, et cetera, television, in large part because it's making so much money off of television, has been slower to change. You do not really think about going to get your news on foxnews.com or nbcnews.com so much as you think about watching those networks. CNN has made an enormous push in digital. It has hired up pretty much everyone it can get its hands on in digital. At the same time, there's an extraordinary investment in virtual reality, new ways to tell stories along those lines. And then there's the second how you tell the news, which is, does the news necessarily have to be a person sitting at a desk or an extraordinarily large panel of people sitting at desks telling you what the news is? And it doesn't. And that's when you start to think, well, is news Anthony Bourdain or Camus Bell? Is news investing in more films and documentaries and things of that nature? And that's going on all the time. And so yes, in terms of what we prioritize in what we cover, it would be idiotic to not cover the sensational historical moment that is taking place in this country right now, which has ramifications across the world. So that's what we do. But meanwhile, we are investing in covering everything all over the world, all the time, on several different platforms. And it's been, you're sort of constantly learning how to do that, but so far it's been extraordinarily successful.
So you bring up a really interesting idea that has come up actually in talking to all of you in different ways, which is the idea of factual and news kind of information delivered through story. And Jeff, you had a great quote about this when we talked last week, which was that there's a challenge to and a requirement to find that balance between entertainment and advocacy. In part because if you don't have an audience that you're speaking to and you get canceled, you don't have that platform to actually get the message out at all. So staying alive is actually part of the goal set, and that's the entertainment side. But getting the message part across is also necessary, and especially for those of you who have a mission-driven kind of edict at your organizations. Talk a little bit about how you find that balance between entertainment, advocacy, and accuracy.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, right? I mean, for us, story always comes first. So when we look at a movie, right, we don't necessarily look at that movie and go, oh, well, that movie is, a piece of news or an activist tool. It's a story. It's a story about human beings, right? And there may be an underlying issue that's affecting them, but it's really about those people, and that's always the case first. And I think that's how, our documentary and narrative teams, which I'm not a part of, but that's how they've created such great content, right? Because that's really what they look at going in, even though we're mandated around issues. Once we have a really strong story, then it's actually easy, easy is maybe not the best term, but it's clearer how you can create a campaign from that, right? Because when you look at that content, when it's done, whether it's a movie or a television show or a digital video, you can really sort of see how that video treats the human beings around that issue, and that gives you a lens of how you're going to approach that campaign. So for example, right, we did Spotlight a couple years ago, which wouldn't necessarily be a natural movie from an issue sort of bucket standpoint, right? I don't think a lot of people are like, let's talk about clergy sex abuse right now, or investigative journalism, right? That movie's really about both. But when you watch that film, the movie so clearly is about investigative journalism and these people struggling to get this story and what it takes to do that, right? And then how clergy sex abuse has affected those survivors. So in watching that, it becomes really clear what kind of a campaign you can do and how everything we do is painted around humanity. And so we go from there and then we look at the landscape and we say, well, what's needed in the landscape? And we know that investigative journalists are not as well funded as they should be, or they don't have as much access as they might want, or et cetera. And maybe not enough people outside of the Catholic going audience knows about clergy sex abuse. So then you say, okay, we're going to build a campaign around awareness, and we're going to build something that will help investigative journalism. So we wound up building a fellowship called the Spotlight Fellowship for Journalists, and then we also helped create videos with survivors so that they can talk about their experience. And we helped Bishop Accountability, which is this one particular group. They're now out in the field right now recording more survivors so that ultimately they will be housed at the Library of Congress, right? So now this is a permanent record. So for us, it's actually, even though it sounds like it's complicated, it's not, because it's story first when it comes to content. And then the campaign is supplemental, right, and lifts that secondarily. But if you don't have good content, it doesn't matter how good your campaign is, because people are attracted to and emotional about content. That's what brings them to the table to be open to the campaign.
Sorry, go ahead.
And just riffing on that, to switch over to news, imagery is what we deal in, is so striking, and it can be used to tell an effective story, but it also can drive the news. I mean, and not always in perhaps the most efficacious or beneficial way. I'm old enough that I remember back in time, I was there when we were able to start showing color photography within a day or two of the book being closed, about before the magazine would come out. It used to be you had to have the color way in advance, and there was some printing. I mean, a lot of what we do is driven by technological advances that then makes the form change and it makes the content change. And so I remember asking the managing editor if there was a story that had no image and a story that had a color image. He said, there's no question that we go with the story with the color image, even if the other one presumably had a higher calorie content when it came to the news. And in terms of television, the line's long, but if it bleeds, it leads. If you've got something that really has a visual impact, that's going to take precedence over anything else virtually. And it's just a factor that we have to deal with. And as you get into virtual reality and things like that, the image is so powerful. And there's just a risk of, it's just the flip side of what Ashley's talking about. You've got to find a great story in order to deliver it. You've got to find the imagery that's going to get you that. But sometimes the imagery that we get on the news side of things drives at the expense of content, or there's a risk anyway.
Yeah, so just picking up on that story thing, and this point is probably obvious to everyone in this community, but it bears repeating over and over and over. The notion of putting different forms of content into different silos, like you do fictional television, you do digital content, you do news gathering, is not a consideration that should be happening once you get outside of your own organization, because the story is the only thing that matters, and the competition is just extraordinarily different. Everyone is competing with everyone. So there are a lot of people in my industry who still think, okay, how did CNN do in the ratings versus Fox News and MSNBC? Which is irrelevant, because you're arguing over a total population that's less than the size of the 5 boroughs of New York City. It doesn't really matter. What matters is how you did versus ESPN and TNT and Instagram and Facebook and
Call of Duty?
Call of Duty. Yeah, no, actually, I always overlook this because I don't play video games, but that's like huge. You think from an advertising perspective, which of course still drives much of my industry, how many viewers do we have? It doesn't matter if those viewers are like my wife, who like spends like 45 minutes out of the 48 minutes of the show like scrolling through her phone for other content, not watching the advertising or the branding. So that is, again, just to go back to my industry, it's like the old model of news, where you could just present someone with like a 3-minute update of here's what happened in Brazil, here's what happened in London, here's what happened in Singapore, doesn't work because there's not really a story there. You need that for 4 minutes when you're at the airport boarding your plane. You don't need, there's no engagement there. And so what CNN has tried to do, which is what everyone tries to do, which is what you do and you do, is we have tried to take the news and create a story around it, or recognize the story that's there and keep people engaged with it, whether that's through pushing that story forward or providing analysis to it. And you can look at other networks like ESPN or NBA on TNT, and they're trying to do the same thing around sports.
I think the risk of telling a story in the allegedly non-scripted world is, and I said this with full respect, is we always compress when we're telling stories. We always condense. And there's a line that I'm always telling my writers in the writer's room, which is art is the little lie that tells the bigger truth. And so I'm willing, even when adapting a book or a nonfiction piece, to fudge, as long as I feel what it's serving ultimately is the higher truth of what the author or what the project was trying to achieve. But I think I wonder, and I'm not attacking the news, but I'm just wondering, it's a temptation, and I wonder if the same standard applies, because we all know about stories that it makes a better story can we do that take again where we get the person to cry? Can we do something to get that shot?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, just because you're bringing, I would really quickly, there's really telling a story with the news, which is just faking it, which is what Sean Hannity is doing with the death of Seth Rich at the DNC. Which is just a conspiracy theory. You're just telling a story to get your viewers' blood flowing. Then there's news, real news, which, in the interest of telling a story, involves a lot of analysis, involves a lot of partisan analysis, involves a lot of people who come on and sort of spin things in a way that, is probably like mudslinging panels might not necessarily be to the benefit of the nation. Focusing almost exclusively on Donald Trump and therefore missing other stories because there are only 24 hours in a day, you can argue that maybe news organizations should do something else. But fundamentally, the story that CNN and I think many other news networks are going for is trying to capture the full swath of the country and recognize that there's both news, there's a debate. Our country is partisan. To pretend it's not would be a joke. To try and represent all the different viewpoints and understand that some of those viewpoints are rooted in a sort of skewed version of the world. But you're right, it's a constant risk, and it's one that I'm sure the people who are above my pay grade deal with every day.
I think the other thing, when you think about news, on looking at documentary and looking at some of those, if you look at the documentaries that do well, and I say well, I mean those that perform to the extent that any documentary does at the box office, right? Or that it wins awards, or in the very rare examples, like, something like Blackfish, you've seen that film, right? Gets across and has a huge and measurable impact on a film, or on an issue rather. The story is central, right? And there, you can go on YouTube and you could spend every waking moment of your life watching documentaries, and there's all sorts of channels and platforms and things like that. And I'll tell you, spending a lot of my life around docs, not all of them are entertaining, and they're not, unless you are really into that issue or are into that genre, you're not going to be that viewer who's going to stay and watch the next one. So story is so key, and I think that's why you see some really successful documentarians who all of a sudden get snatched up to do a new feature by the new studio, right? Because they look at someone who's young and a go-getter who knows how to, among other things, tell stories. Not because they did a great thing on climate change, it's because they drew together a narrative that could work for the next, whatever, big superhero film. And so I agreed with everything you said. I sat there thinking, what else can I offer? I can't. I mean, story is so key. For someone who works for a philanthropist, if if it weren't about story, I would just counsel Paul to just give his money, like give it to a climate change fund, right? If you're going to invest in using media to drive impact, you can't just make a bunch of PSAs. It must be story driven. And the docs that don't do that are the ones that the ones that actually can hit it, are the ones that deliver the news, but do it with style and story and in a way that is going to get someone's eyeballs on it and say, that's interesting. It's why you see the different distributors out there, like a Netflix, like Amazon, and others starting to spend real money on documentaries, right? But they're spending the money on docs that either have a really big name attached to them, or it's story, where someone's flipping around on their Netflix queue and says, that's a story I want to watch, right? That's something I'm interested in. Because the activists might look at it and say, I'm really into climate change, I want to watch that. But Netflix is willing to spend $3 million on a documentary because someone's going to flip through their queue and say, I want to watch that on a Friday night. People don't want to watch, they don't want to eat spinach on a Friday night. They want to have something more entertaining.
Yeah, and I was going to just say that, in the scripted side of the space, it's less about factual accuracy and more about emotional accuracy. And one big change I have seen in my brief-ish career is that now, if you're telling a story and the emotional story, and you don't have some access to someone who has lived it or experienced it, if it is an issue based about gender, sex, sexuality, whatever, if you're not talking to someone who has lived that, so you have the emotional accuracy of the experience, it's not going to fly anymore, which I think is very different than how it had been in the past, where it's like, let's write about that. That's the topic du jour. We don't need to talk to anyone. Let's just imagine what we would feel like in those shoes. And that's very much frowned upon. So there's a big urgency to get the emotional feelings correct when telling those types of stories.
And it's interesting to reflect on what's happened to society between when you wrote your initial pilot and then when you were able to do your last project, because all of us really, we may work different sides of the street, but we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. And Shelley called poets the unseen legislators of the world, and it's hard to know who has an impact, but we're all doing, whether it's a film, whether it's a TV show, whether it's a news report, and I think it's the aggregation of these things. And it's always an interesting question about what moves the needle, so to speak, among the populace, what makes them more tolerant towards the LGBT community. Is it because Will and Grace got the ball rolling a while ago? Does it get them talking to people? And it's it's one of the mysteries, it's one of the real challenges and pleasures of the business is that you do your best, and you can't always know what impact you're having, but you do your best.
I think that's really key. I don't know if it's different with you, but at Participant, we definitely impact is a marathon, it's not a sprint, right? Which is actually interesting because content and content distribution is a sprint, essentially, right? You have a theatrical window, you have a DVD window, whatever, you have an SVOD window, the run up to that might be a few months of festival. More and more people are just releasing in the fall if you have an awards movie, nothing earlier. So you have this very short window where you're like, okay, I know we have 3 months before release, we have release, maybe we have a few months after release, or maybe a little bit more if it's an awards window. And that's it for that movie. And that's, we sort of load a lot into that window because we're using the movie to lift, right, what the issue is. But we know that long-term impact around whatever that issue is isn't just coming from our single piece of content, whether it's a movie or TV show or whatever. It's lots of different things. And sometimes you sort of have, you're lucky, right? You have lightning in a bottle and you hit the zeitgeist. That's an inconvenient truth for us. It was, amazing film, amazing documentary, but also good time, good place, to illuminate the world about this issue. We're now releasing an inconvenient sequel, and it's a very different world that we're in, right? What it was before was not enough people knew about climate change at all. So it was you have to bring about an awareness and you have to get everyone to know. Now people know. And now it's everyone out there is going, what can I do? And we've discovered that there's this hope gap where people are like, I want to do something, but I have no idea what I can do. And actually, when I think about the issue, only government can do it. So I give up. And so we've now moved into a completely different cycle of what is the impact that this content can have, because the issue itself has also changed over time. And you can look at the LGBTQI movement in the same way. We've looked at that span from sort of the first moment of a recognized media hit, which I believe was a documentary in the 60s that sort of showed, gay and lesbian characters up until now. And that's 50 years, right? And when Gallup was taking polls around that issue in the beginning of the 60s, they were asking people, what do you think about gay and homosexual people? But moving forward, when you look at the Gallup polls in the 90s and more recently, there had been such a shift already because of the instances of media that they no longer needed to ask that, and now they were asking, how do you feel about LGBTQ marriage, right? It had shifted. So impact for sure is a marathon, and so I think rarely is there a one-to-one where you can go, well, this movie did X. There are exceptions to that rule. I can think of one, which is we worked on Joshua Oppenheimer's The Look of Silence, which was about the Indonesian genocide, but really it was The Act of Killing. The Act of Killing, his first feature, actually changed history in Indonesia. No one in Indonesia had been talking about the genocide before that, and that movie helped spurn that entire country to open a dialogue. But that is the exception, not the rule, right? Like, that's an incredibly rare case. So yeah, it's a whole piece, and it's not a one-to-one, but that doesn't mean that you can't be part of it, and moreover, that whatever part you have in it is just as important, right? Because all of those pieces together are what drive that change and drive that movement as a combination of things, and without each and every one of them, you would probably not have the same impact.
To jump on that, because what's interesting about Upworthy, which was a digital media company in the model of a BuzzFeed, so we had data integrated into everything we were doing and sort of monitoring that data and shifting our storytelling and our models and our formats for better engagement and shareability was a part of our business, the way it is every digital media publisher. But what made us different was we had a mission, we were on a mission, and so we started to track some of the impact of those stories as well, in part and due to a grant that we were able to secure to do some of that data science research and work. And so we look to do studies to say, is there any measurable impact in the sprint sense? What changes hearts and minds? Is there anything we can learn in these short pieces, understanding that absolutely every word you just said is exactly correct. It is a marathon, it is cumulative, it is societal, it is exposure. But we've been embedding sort of these testing philosophies and metrics in the content that we've been pushing out thematically, and then taking audiences that were exposed and measuring some key indicators from them. And we've been able to see some really interesting trends. One of the ones that we were able to see is that knowledge is much less important than how you feel about an issue. So we can give you all the this is the story, right? Again, we have to put the carrot in the cake. If you care about an issue, it's much more likely that you're going to actually take action, self-report that you're going to take action, tell other people about the issue, than if you know a lot about an issue. And so we wasted a lot of time trying to get people super, super, super educated, which didn't have the payoff that we wanted. We also saw that the way that we frame an issue has to account for the hope gap. If you feel hopeless, if you feel like there's nothing you can do, there's nothing anyone can do, it's too late, it's too alarmist, it's too desperate, everything about your intent to take action and your actual willingness to take action goes down. So really highlighting that progress is possible and showing where progress is being made is proving to be really important in sort of changing those hearts and minds and driving people towards impact. We've seen that time spent exposed is critical. And so the more of us telling stories, whether they're representation stories, diversity stories, issue stories, the more of those stories that an individual encounters, the more likely they are to take action, the more they will feel differently about it. And so there is just the cumulative effect of seeing the story told over and over again, or exposure to the story through a bunch of different ways that's going to sort of drive that. And then there's a tipping point at which you have become aware and you have a feeling about it. And we've shown that then you remain changed 6 and 9 months after the last time that you encountered a piece of content from us on that subject. And we've done this about broad subjects, but also about relatively narrow subjects. So if we're talking about vaccination, you're getting a lot of information about vaccinations, and that's happening. But then we've gone really specific and topical on Zika, on kind of some other autoimmune issues, and we've still seen these trends 6 and 9 months out. So you're not likely to be encountering a ton of information similar to the ones that we've been putting out, which causes me to think that it's actually, we all have to be pulling in the same direction. And it is the cumulative effect of all of us working together to sort of raise those voices and tell those stories that is going to actually bring about the long-term change that I think we're after.
Yeah, and reinforcing what Ashley was saying about the importance of story, I mentioned this when we were talking among ourselves about the distinction between two very good films, The Civil Action and Aaron Brockovich, both of which were about class action suits about polluting groundwater, and one of which did tremendous box office and one didn't. The Civil Action was much more granular in its approach, and not documentary, but certainly was more sober, whereas Aaron Brockovich was really, the greater story was about how this woman, this very fascinating and challenged woman, overcame odds to actually lead this campaign. And I would suggest that the impact on the audience is to identify with that person and say, I can campaign for social change too. And the issue, what she was campaigning for, and the company she was going against probably is faded, but the message is that one person can make a difference. Whereas Civil Action, which was a brilliantly done film, it just didn't have the same cumulative emotional power, more intellectually based film. And so, it also reminds me of a lesson I learned very early. I wrote the finale. I wrote the season premiere to a Remington Steele that took place in Monte Carlo, and I was very proud of it because it was very complicated, and I could explain everything at the end. And it had the typical scene where Pierce Brosnan and Stephanie Zimbalist are being held up by the guy who's an Interpol agent, and then Pierce is saying, "Oh, now I get it. And when this happened, it was because of this, and when that happened, because of that, and then something happens, there's a run and jump, and they get the bad guy." And I said to my wife afterwards, "So what did you think?" She said, "Well, actually, once I knew who did it, I just wanted it to be over." So once the guy pulled the gun, it's like, but it all fit. She said, "I didn't care," So it was an important lesson,
So I want to triangulate a few things that have been said. And I know we talked about context change, especially on social issues over the last decade. We've seen some pretty dramatic changes on things like gay rights and climate change, even species extinction in terms of awareness, which often means when you're thinking about the things you're producing from a long game perspective, whether it's a TV show that's on for many years or a sequel to a movie you're working on, or just a topic in your organization that you're producing multiple titles around, or a topic that you're producing in the news day after day over time. The context changes, which means your goals have to change in terms of what you're trying to do. So that presents a challenge both from sort of understanding what is success and what does success look like, and then how do you know you've succeeded? How do you measure that? So talk a little bit about, especially those of you who've gone on that journey where you started out on a topic where it had very low awareness, and now we're at a point where it has very high awareness, and there are new things coming into that discussion. How do you evolve the content and the dialogue at your organization, and how do you know you're being successful as you do that evolution?
I can think of one good example. Well, it's an example. You guys can determine whether it's good or not. We did a film called The Ivory Game, which was a Netflix original that came out last fall. That was we co-produced with a group in Europe, and Leonardo DiCaprio came on as the executive producer. Netflix did a lot of great things with it. It documents the story of the ivory trade leaving East Africa, making its way through Southeast Asia and into China, among other places. And the film, in addition to being sort of like a thriller and things like that, it is not incredibly kind to China, right? The film came out in early November. It was shortlisted for an Oscar. It was great, and then lo and behold, China announces that they are going to close down their commercial ivory trade by the end of this year. Now, to be clear, we're not sitting here saying that it was the film that did that. We like to think that we know people inside the government saw it. We like to think it helped. But there was countless other factors at play there, including a great deal of pressure from the United States and others. But here we were with this film that had only been out in the world for 2 months. The sort of a great deal of message in it was that the demand in the world for ivory is largely what drives these horrible killings going on of elephants in Africa, and the landscape had changed a little bit. So what we are in the process of doing now is we've pivoted a bit, and the film was actually in the Beijing International Film Festival last month, which was huge, right? Because that meant that the Chinese government approved that taking place. And now we're doing a bunch of screening events around China, right? So we're moving from, okay, so this is the law now, right? And how do you pivot to move to a situation where it's like, okay, now what next? So why, just because a law is in place doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be enforced. forced. And so how can we continue to, now that the Chinese are welcoming this conversation internally, it's great that people here in the States and in Western Europe have watched this film, but frankly, as the activist side of me is most interested in folks in East Africa and in China watching it, because so they can sort of put a little bit more, I was about to say humanity, but it doesn't really work when you're talking about elephants, but you get my point, to the issue. And so as China, if they stay on schedule, they'll close down their commercial trade by the end of this year, but that there's still the black market, there's still things that can go on here. And so part of what we're trying to do with the film and our outreach and educational work with our partners and things like that is to say, okay, let's continue to sort of keep our foot on the gas here to share story about elephants with the Chinese public, because even though it's illegal, it's like anything else, if there's still a demand for it. Rhino horn, for example, not to get too wonky, has been illegal since the early 1990s, yet there's still a huge market for it. So the landscape literally changed, and we're trying to catch up, right? And we're thrilled that it changed. We're thrilled that it changed in that way. And but in terms of what we do and how we measure what success will look like, that's going to have to evolve. And that example, I think, could be used on climate and on countless other social issues where the landscape continues to evolve. And if you are running a campaign, you can't just sit back. You have to live in it, right? And figure out how are you going to pivot midstream. Otherwise, the world will just pass you by.
Interesting synergy with Dylan's world too on that, because I just heard an NPR report about this whole field, and it was the death of Cecil the lion. You know, that guy from Minneapolis or Minnesota had shot. That thing went viral on the news, and that impact also, coupled with having the awareness out there, I think has helped drive down the trade, because they said that had impact in a lot of ways about transporting, that all the airlines now say they won't transport this stuff. So it's everybody working together on these things. But one other thing about China, and certainly in the broadcast network world, we can do a lot of things on Designated Survivor, and we had a terrorist take off at the end of this season, but the one country they wouldn't allow him to land in, I'm talking about our network holders, you know, our corporate brethren, was China. No, China's not going to be a player in this conspiracy. I mean, you have to be this is ABC,
anywhere else.
ABC, Disney, you know, China is off limits as far as content is concerned, and that's I understand it, but it's just the opposite problem. I mean, I'm sure it's a problem for you too. I mean, China is a powerful market, and that's where everybody wants to go, but short of putting Matt Damon in a Chinese epic, it's difficult to crack that market.
I think to your point, right, the important thing, yes, you have to be ready to pivot. I think the key element there, though, is you have to see those changes as doors being opened, right, and not doors being closed, because, like, your plan can't go like you thought it could go, right, which is silly, right? I think this is great, because now there's an entire audience in China who probably would not have seen or considered this film because the government would not have let it in, right? So now you've gone from sort of, I mean, it's amazing. Oftentimes the arc is like awareness, individual behavior change, and then institutional change, right? Whether it's leaders and then ultimately policy. You got to jump to policy, which is like nobody, you so rarely go from here to here. Right. So now they won the policy box, right? Like, check. And now you have to go back, and now what you're doing, which is great, is you're now working on the awareness section, right? And the personal behavior section, because again, regardless of whatever policy is, if people keep driving that market. So for us, whenever something shifts, we always sort of go, okay, well, what door is this opening? And where can we then use that to keep moving? So it's never a bad thing, right? Even if it's generally something good, or it offers a new opportunity where hopefully, you can get the word out. It's like, I think Trump is a good example. Like, there's a lot of worries about climate change with Trump. But with that said, I also think because Trump is in the White House, there's now a lot of interest in climate that probably really didn't exist 4 months ago, when all of us were talking about an inconvenient sequel and what we were going to do. When Trump came out, we were like, okay, now we know for sure this is going to be in the dialogue. So this is really opening doors for us in terms of people's interest in flocking to the
but in the short term, you have a EPA director who is a climate change denier,
yes,
and so can we survive the next 4 years?
Can we survive the next 20 days?
Yeah, 20 minutes. Yeah,
So
what time is it? Right.
Yeah. You actually kind of teed up a question, and you might be
Yeah.
able to talk about this too, which is how do you engage skeptics? And in some cases, Dylan, you're dealing with being, attacked as being fake news while trying to cover fake news as a news topic, and also trying to be accurate, right? So how do you engage people who disagree with you, whether it's conservatives or just skeptics on a topic? There are people on the liberal side who are anti-vaxxers, but you might be covering something around the topic of healthcare, right? So how do you engage people who actually don't agree with some of these topics to participate in the conversation?
Sure. Just to address the last point very quickly, the sort of one silver lining of setbacks in terms of issues, policy, advocacy, whatever, is that it almost always drives more engagement, which is why the political pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, and why you go from a Clinton to a Bush to an Obama to a Trump. And probably the million-dollar question is figuring out how to maintain that engagement when you're in power. But I would just say it is probably easier to drive engagement for issues like climate change and other things, other progressive causes, under a Trump administration than it was under an Obama administration. Although, precisely because the head of the EPA and because the President of the United States feel like a Category 5 threat.
So there's your encouragement for
So
the
there's,
day.
good luck, everybody. In response to the other question about how you engage with skeptics, I've thought about this a lot because there are so many people who think about the mainstream media as fake news because trust in media is at an all-time low. And it's really, it's always been exploited by politicians, especially by Republicans, going back for decades. Right before George H.W. Bush lost re-election, his last appeal to voters was annoy the media, elect Bush. But it's really bad now, to the point where, well-intentioned people keep saying, oh, well, we've got fact-checking organizations to tell you what's right and wrong. That does not matter if Trump's core supporters have already decided that they are going to write off everything you say because you're a liar and you're part of a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it's like what Nicole said, if they don't feel it.
Right, so so there's no, that decision has been made up, and in terms of really engaging like core skeptics like that, I actually don't think it's possible. So that's super reassuring. But I don't. I just think that there are people in this country who are not going to engage, who have made up their mind, and it's going to take. There's no answer about something that the media can do or that the cultural zeitgeist can do within a matter of days or weeks or even years. Much the same way that when it comes to the continued existence of people with antiquated worldviews, some of them you're just going to have to wait for them to die off. Sorry. However, that said, it would be really wrong, at least of my industry, and I think this is actually really true of across the so-called content industry, in terms of how we have helped fuel the partisan divides going on in this country. We have been so sure of the progressive arc of history that we have at times forgot to listen to people with opposing views. We have been dismissive of them. We have shut them out, rather than sort of trying to be sympathetic and compassionate to where they come from. Because it is so easy to write off people who seem antiquated, xenophobic, backwards, whatever. It's so much easier to write them off. In terms of the coverage of the 2016 campaign, there's no question that across the mainstream media there was a blind spot to the emotional condition of disenfranchised middle class and lower middle class white, suburban, exurban, and rural Americans. We just covered it primarily from a view that Obama had been charging in the right direction and Hillary Clinton was going to do the same thing. And so that was a huge blind spot for us. I think in terms to sort of get out of my industry and think about how you engage a larger audience, remember sympathy and compassion. And that doesn't mean sacrificing your causes. It doesn't mean saying, well, I'm not going to fight as hard for climate change and the content that I cover, the stories I pick up, do fight for them. But remember that everybody's story is interesting. Remember that that the stories of people who don't agree with you are interesting. Remember that your ability to impact change is a lot more interesting if you listen to them and tell their story rather than telling them who they are and what they are.
Here's a fun fact that we've tested and proved, that the notion of affirmation as an introduction to a conflict dialogue works. And here's a really simple way we tested this. We intentionally showed a series of pro-choice stories to a pro-life audience. We intentionally showed a series of vaccination and immunity stories to an anti-vaxxer audience. We have a holler. You've all encountered a holler when you come to a web page and you're starting to enjoy the content and a box pops up and it gets in your way and you have to close out and it tells you something like sign up for a newsletter or donate money. This holler, we gave the exposed groups two different hollers. One of the hollers was like, hey, thanks for stopping by, subscribe to our newsletter. The other holler said, take a minute, breathe. You're a good person. You're engaging with content that is important and that's thought-provoking. Good for you. Just a nice little, you're great. You're actually great. Sit for a moment and think about how great you are. And then we surveyed them afterwards. We had a series of data runs that we ran afterwards, and it's a significant uptick in receptivity to conflicting content when you've been validated at a human level first, which is exactly what you were just saying. The people on the other side of the divide are not blind evil monsters, no matter how much the outcome of their actions may look or feel that way. And when we engage with our audiences, though a subset of them are, we lose that audience immediately. And we also lose credibility with the rest of the audience whose views are not black and white. They are shaded. And there are audience members who feel very strongly about pro-choice, but are also anti-vaxxers. And so the not alienating and starting from the presumption that people are human and good and interested in a good and positive outcome actually significantly improves the impact of your storytelling and allows you to speak to skeptics more effectively than you would otherwise.
Yeah, I think this is also, we talk a lot about the nuance of language and being incredibly cognizant about that. So I think for sure there's stalwart people who have certain ideas, right? And they're not going to be moved, and we've accepted that. So we're looking at a different group, and sometimes we call them the movable middle. And then what we also find is amongst groups, and we'll use climate change as an example because it's the ongoing example, there's a lot of groups that think they don't agree and think they're at odds with one another, but if you look very closely at who they are and their values and their language, they're not, and they're mistaken, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, if you speak with conservatives about climate, conservatives go, I'm not an environmentalist, I'm not a hippie, I'm not interested in that, but they're like, I'm a conservationist and I believe in protecting the public parks, right? Which is like, that's exactly what environmentalists do. Okay? So it really just becomes about a nuance in language and about your angle when you're talking about the issue, right? And I think we see this, you can see this sort of with Al Gore, he sort of changed his presentation around climate, but some rooms, when you go in and talk to a room, maybe you're going to talk about environmentalism and, saving the otter or whatever, right? But some rooms, when you go in there, you need to talk about business and you need to talk about how wind and solar is going to save their town a ton of money, in addition to actually making their children healthier, right? Like this is what we found in working with mayors or speaking with the mayor of Salt Lake City. Like when they looked at Salt Lake, which is primarily conservative as a city, as an area, when they started talking about the fact that they had terrible pollution and their children's rate of asthma went way up, all of a sudden, all of those conservatives were like, oh no, we need rules. We need rules about pollution. It's not okay for our kids to get sick, right? So it's really just about the perspective and the angle, and then being really cognizant about and carefully choosing your words, because some words just really set people off. They have baggage with them, whether you like it or not, that if you don't bring it up in that room, you're going to get much farther.
It's interesting. So this idea of connecting emotionally too. I know, Jeff, you had a great story about Army wives and how you do that in the writer's room through casting people who had actually, I say casting, but hiring people who had been in those situations that the characters were going to be in. Can you talk a little bit about that for the people who did get to hear that story already?
Yeah, on Army Wives, by the time the show was over and we had a nice 7-year run, I had 2 West Point grads, and one of whom had served in Special Forces and Rangers. I had an African-American female pilot from the Air Force. I had a female Marine Corps captain, and I had a couple people who'd grown up in the South. Because I felt that the rural exposure was very important to the show. So, I mean, when I had the good fortune to sign on to that show after its first episode, and it was based on a book, so it was based on a really terrific nonfiction book by a reporter named Tanya Bianc, who grew up as a military brat and wrote about a series of murders actually at Fort Bragg that became the basis for the characters in the show. So it was a relative advantage of looking at the pilot because the greater part of the iceberg is getting to the pilot, and I didn't have to worry about any of that, but I was able to watch the film and say, wow, this is really engaging to me. I really like these people. I understand these people. And it was the only show I could compare it to in my experience was Northern Exposure, in the sense that it created its own little world. It had its own rules, and you didn't have to rely on car crashes or body drops to get your act breaks. It was all based on human situations. So it was very intriguing that way. But in order to get the stories, having grown up in a suburb of Chicago and gone to an Ivy League school, and even though I had 7 years of reporting and spent time with the Army and the Marines and had done my fair amount of rural work, I wanted people who could bring their life stories to it. And we also every year would go to a military base or two and spend time with families and talk to them directly about their experiences, and would get their feedback, and took all that very seriously. So a lot of the stories that emerged were only slightly disguised stories that we'd gotten from the people we talked to. And we'd get a lot of feedback from people, even if we were reaching for a story that was just purely from our own imaginations, and people would say that really resonated with us because I think we were reacting like those characters. But it's interesting in terms of the political divide. You think about most people in the military being more conservative bent, but once you get to know, I mean, as far as we were concerned, they were just really fascinating people to get to know. And most of the military, especially at the officer level that I talked to, didn't vote. Not because they weren't patriotic, but because they didn't want it to get in the way of what they had to do. So it was that their job was to be a soldier and to serve whoever was the commander-in-chief. But I don't think you can spend time with the military or any of our armed forces or law enforcement officers without developing great respect for them and insight into what they do.
So just very quickly to pick up on that, I mean, that is, going back to the importance of story, at least when you're talking about nonfiction work or the way that real experiences can inform fiction. There are so many stories out there. There's more stories out there than there's time to tell, based off of real people and their lives and their conditions. B, all of these stories are incredibly nuanced, and so much more nuanced than the news cycle or fitting things into boxes or research surveys will ever tell you. At the human level, at the storytelling level, they're all sort of fascinating if you tell them the right way. And then the third thing I'd say is, like, the audience, everyone in this room, myself included, like, we all have a ton of sensibility about things. We all have a ton of emotional reaction and feeling to things that we bring to every single story, no matter what it is. Stories are so much more powerful when you leave that up to the viewer, I think. Rather than trying to beat them over the head with the way that they should be feeling about something. So it is very possible to tell a very powerful, nuanced story about, say, an Army veteran in pick your city, and what he's going through without telling people how to feel about it. And it's very possible to tell that story and have people walk away with 100 different views, or a conservative view and a liberal view on what's going on. That is not what content creators bring to the table. What they bring to the table are the stories for people to have emotional responses to.
Yeah, it's interesting that we were very proud that there were a number of shows that got on the air that were at the time that we went into Afghanistan and to Iraq, and they all failed within the first year, except for our show, which ran for 7 years. It was the only show that succeeded that was at least nominally about the longest conflicts in our nation's history. And I think it's because we focused on, particularly the wives, but their families, their kids, the holistic aspect of their lives. And you never lost sight of the fact that the people in that show were fighting, that members of those families were fighting a war, but we were focusing on the domestic front for the most part. We spent a fair amount of time in combat as it got further on, but I think it makes a comment in itself that was, and it's often an accident. You talk about being lucky and capturing light. I mean, that set of characters, that set of actresses and actors, and the setting, and all just lined up, and the public went for it for a long time. And again, I'm quite proud of the fact that show did. It didn't last as long as the conflict has, but it was on there for a good long time.
Well, that's the other lesson. Don't tell a story if you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And if you don't know what the hell you're talking about, do what you did and get people who know what the hell they're talking about to inform your thinking. Very often, like, actors, screenwriters, directors will tell you that the most important person they had on the set was someone who never came on camera, never wrote down a word, never made a direction call, but had real world perspective about the story people were trying to tell, and was able to inform that across cast, crew, etc.
And like you said, even in your news reporting, have respect for the subjects that you're writing about, even if they're on the other side of some political
100%.
divide. And I think that's what Spotlight did. I mean, it really humanized that story, and there was some pretty devilish behavior in that, but you understood it, at least.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. Tom McCarthy and Josh Singer, who's the director and the writer, worked with survivors and had them read the script during some of that process. And there were moments in that story which came from those survivors, like the fact that you see female survivors in that movie is directly because survivors read the script and said, it's a problem you're not showing women. There are women survivors, and everyone always thinks it's men, and that's not okay, right? And so that is a key element of having authenticity, right, and truth in whatever material you're writing, which is not easy to measure, possibly impossible to measure, but yet somehow we all can feel and sense when things are not checking those boxes.
Okay, well, I'm not yet being given the get off the stage signal, so I will take a couple questions from the audience for this group. Otherwise, I'll keep asking one more time. I'm going to wrap this up soon, but are there any questions from the audience? And if so, raise your hand, and then I'll have you ask it, and then I'll repeat it for the webcast. Back of the room, yeah.
I'm wondering about it, but everything you said has to do with words. We're media, right? TV. And you say, and there's some righteousness to this, but I'm disputing it, that you got to affect people emotionally, respect them, and confirm them, and then deliver your message. But all of you seem to subscribe to the belief that this is our best way of communicating, 150 units per minute, when you got video.
I don't think we said that.
Yeah, I think. I mean, you want to hit people in the limbic system, the way, excuse the expression, the Republican Party does. You don't use words, because launderiness don't work, even if they're true. You find another way in, energetically and acoustically.
So I'm gonna rephrase that shorter, which is basically what are ways other than words to really connect with people emotionally through story, through news, et cetera?
Yeah, I think all of us have talked about the importance of images, and didn't mean to suggest that it's a debate or a piece of theater, although I love theater. But visual imagery is really important, and so if that's the message that came through, I'd certainly like to amend it from my perspective. I mean, as we're talking about that image of Cecil the Lion, for example, that energized a lot of people, and I always tell my writers that the best special, because now with CGI, there's so many things we can do to change an image, but I said the best special effect ever invented is the human face. And so if you can just put the camera on somebody who's actually doing something that's going to affect you, that's important. I mean, but we are, speaking for us, we're writers, so words do matter, but words coupled with image, you know.
Well, I was just going to say, what you didn't talk too much about, we touched on the different media out there. Dylan talked about things beyond TV, beyond video. We didn't talk too much about sort of using different technology to deliver some of that imagery and some of that story and tailoring that specifically to audience. And it's maybe not directly addressing your question, but one thing that when we think about the actual issues that we're trying to touch on, certainly we all wanted the big distribution deal and get the film out far and wide, but when you think about impact, sometimes you need to go figure out how to take that film and get it specifically in front of those people who have agency, who have the ability to actually either move the needle on an issue, whether they be policy leaders, policymakers, elected officials, and things like that. And having 2 senators on the right committee seeing a film can have far more impact than 6 million people who live all around the country, right? So if it's all about impact, then what's the means to do that? Whether it's events, whether it's the stuff we all carry around in our hands and our phones and things like that. And one thing that we try to do more and more is figure out how to tailor content specifically. In addition to the films that we create, how do we do additional content? That Racing Extinction example, as well as it did on Discovery, some 35 million viewers on air around the world. We've had far more people watch our smaller, shorter content around specific issues. You could make the case, I don't have the data in front of me right now, but you can make the case that those specific small pieces have had more impact than that one 90-minute doc broadcast that happened a year and a half ago on TV.
Yeah. Okay, on that note, now I'm getting the get off the stage signal. So I want to thank our panelists. We could probably spend another 2 hours on talking about stuff. Thank you. You know you have a good panel when you can ask 3 questions and they'll keep talking.